Welcome everybody to the Carpool Chats. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a very interesting topic. It's some buzz that's been going around for the better part of this year, and even with the COVID pandemic, we've been tracking the environment, social, and governance planning, ESG planning, that's been getting picked up and pushed forward by a number of financial institutions. And one of the things that really caught my eye when this first started coming out in January. Now, of course, this has been going on for the better part of a couple of years now, but in January it got a big leg up. But what really caught my eye when I first started looking at ESG planning was the potential to increase a company's revenue. Much like when back in 2007, 2008, the renewable fuel standard came out, and for the downstream retailer and jobbers, it was a voluntary program. And so it looked like this big hurdle of regulatory compliance and everything. It was this big, scary program for renewable fuels. But when we start to really digest it and look at the program, and we start to see the incentives that it brings to the table for the downstream industry, it is very important for those folks that are in the industry to get involved. And those that did jump in, even on a voluntary basis, they jumped in. And over the course of the years, they've seen enormous benefits from the incentives that the RFS brings with RIN credits, with renewable fuel blending. And it really did add and continues to add to the retail industry's bottom line. So I kind of, when I started to see the messaging on ESG come out, and we began to dig into what has ESG done for privately held and publicly held companies, we stepped back and we looked at S&P 500, S&P 1500 valuations, and what we noted was a very distinct increased valuation for companies that have adopted ESG planning versus those that have not. And the incredible thing about this is that this held true through the pandemic and still holds true today. We are seeing an increased level of participation in ESG planning. And so anytime we see something that rings that true, we want to make sure that industry is aware of it and can potentially take advantage of it. So without further ado, we brought to the table today Ryan Scott, who's the Vice President of Policy for HBW. HBW is a management consulting firm. And Scott, Ryan and I started talking about this several months ago, and looking at some of the things that are on the horizon. And I was hoping, Ryan, if you could give some background on ESG for folks that are aware of it a little bit, but obviously this is going to be a big deal coming up here very soon. Please shed some color on this.
Sure, happy to do it, Jeff, and thanks for including me on this discussion. It's hard, we talked about this earlier. It's challenging sometimes to walk yourself back from your own context and perspective, and that's a little bit of the challenge in the ESG discussion. This is a topic that I've been discussing it with clients and other folks for the past several years. So I'm pretty deep into it, but I do think, taking a step back and being reminded that not everybody has the same perspective that I do or the same background that I do is useful. And looking back at it, if I wanted to try and break it down, there's kind of, first of all, ESG is environmental social governance, and it's meant to be a way. It's meant to be a way to quantitatively track an organization's performance relative to those three primary factors: environment, social interaction, and governance. And there's a lot of rabbit holes that we can go down. There's a lot of trigger words, frankly, when we get into this discussion, just depending on what your perspective is. But at the 3 points that I would want to highlight with regard to ESG, the three main points are, first off, it's a market. What's happening right now is very much market driven. So, there are announcements from, there's all kinds of numbers we can pull from. Probably the shiniest one is the announcement from BlackRock, from their leaders who put companies on notice, basically saying they needed to have some sort of ESG driven discipline in their financial reporting in 2020. And if they did not, there would be consequences for them. So that's a really important point. The second big point is a lot of what we're talking about with regard to ESG draws from existing work, existing reporting, existing protocols and disciplines within companies. So it's understandable that folks hear about ESG and think, oh my goodness, it's a bunch of new regulations, new reporting, new burdens. And that could be the case depending on how your company approaches it. But I would point out that there's a voluntary nature of ESG right now. It's something that companies can choose to do. And frankly, one of the messages I'm preaching is there's a really great opportunity right now for companies to decide what ESG is. There's a lot of ambiguity out there. There are a lot of competing frameworks. There are a lot of different rating agencies. I would encourage companies and industries for that matter, to empower themselves and look at this as an opportunity to make the decision on what ESG will be. So that's the second point of this being about existing work. And finally, what I think is really compelling is this is really about operational efficiencies. So, I think that there's been a tendency to talk about, we talked about the S word earlier, sustainability. Some folks love it. Some folks really, really dislike it in kind of a visceral way. I'm going to suggest that instead of talking about sustainability, we talk about operational efficiencies. So I'm going to paint you with an example from my career. Several years ago, I was a consultant with Deloitte, and I worked in an area called CFO services. So ultimately, we executed projects for CFOs. And one of the projects we did was at Walmart. It was a big software implementation. And I spent about a year and a half in Northwest Arkansas, Monday through Thursday, sometimes Monday through Friday, depending on the weather. Anyway, one of the things that was striking about Walmart, I think a lot of people recognize them as a high-performing company. Depending on which year, they're the biggest earner in the world. They've been a hugely successful enterprise. But way back in 2008, if you walked around the home office in Bentonville, Arkansas, you would see that there was a focus on sustainability. And again, sustainability related to operational efficiency. So there was like a plexiglass display, and it had kind of a picture of some plaster wall, and there was a big hole in the wall, and there was a line on it that said something like, if you don't use insulation in your building, you may as well have a hole this big every 10 feet. So the message was pretty clear. We can do things that might take a little time or a little money that will ultimately save us money. And there's all kinds of other examples like that. But I think put it in the framework of Walmart, sustainability is improved operations. It's not a moral crusade. I mean, people can put value judgments and assign values to it, but the value that really matters to organizations and to investors is the bottom line. So that's the third point. So it's market driven. It's based largely on existing work, and it's really about operational efficiencies for industry.
Yeah, and there's so many examples in the retail industry, right? I mean, we look at our canopy lighting. We look at the efficiency of our refrigeration units. All of these things we do because it's good for our bottom line. And so there's a number of things that are being done. We've got retailers that are introducing low carbon fuels. We've got retailers that are introducing electric vehicle charging stations. All of these things have an impact on, if we want to boil it down and look at CO2 emissions, we can sit down and we can calculate out what is that number. So that's kind of my follow-up question. So for those companies that have a corporate sustainability plan? What is the difference between being that they're both voluntary? What's the difference between a corporate sustainability plan and an ESG plan?
Yeah, I think there's two main differences, and I think both differences are actually advantageous. I do a lot of work in the energy industry with a lot of energy clients and with a lot of oil and gas clients. And there's been a trend over the past 10, 15, 20 years to have, for whoever's driving it, and it's usually from the board, who are usually hearing from shareholders who are saying, you need to have a corporate sustainability report. So, and I'm sure this is true in other industries as well. But what usually winds up happening is that company devotes a lot of resources, usually, a full-time employee or half a full-time employee over the course of a year, winds up devoting a lot of time to compiling this report. And it looks nice, and it often serves as a really pretty paperweight that occasionally gets referenced as kind of a hey, we check the box. So I would say that switching from kind of a corporate sustainability report perspective to an ESG perspective is actually hugely advantageous. And aside from, making it easier for folks who make decisions to actually read, or make it more likely for them to read the work that your organization has put in, it allows you to really just take credit for what you're already doing. So if you have a program that minimizes water usage, or minimizes electricity usage, or increases the efficiency of your fleet, whether by practices or designs, or you have a top rate program to detect radon leaks and or make sure that your underground storage tanks are in really good working condition year in and year out. All of those things are things that ultimately can be quantified, and I think ESG offers an opportunity for you to quantify that and just take proper credit for it from a market perspective. The other piece is, if you are in the retail space, I would say there's no industry that's not assailable by environmental NGOs. So I think there's a real risk that you put all this time and money into your well thought out, well reasoned, well done corporate sustainability report, and despite all of your best efforts in good faith, nonetheless you are labeled as a company that's greenwashing. So one, you take credit from the market, and number two, you disarm critics who might just want to rotate in your company no matter what.
That's been, and excuse me, and so because it's data driven like that, and it's reproducible data, so industries don't get accused of greenwashing. It really allows us to start almost baby steps, right? So the goal is to collect the data, set a baseline for a company, and then from that baseline, you can set incremental goals. And from what I'm seeing, it looks like setting those goals is an important aspect of ESG, where when you first start out, nobody's expecting you to be perfect, right? Nobody's expecting to have a really high ESG score. But the institutions that are watching, the investors that are watching, number one, they want to see an ESG plan in place. And number two, they want to know what that company's goals are for improvement, so that they're messaging out there what is important to the organization. And in a couple different regards, whether you're talking about sustainability or whether you're talking about minimizing risks, you're talking about, is the company looking for longevity? Is the company a good investment? Is the company going to be around for 5, 10, 50 years? And I think that's what a lot of people are looking at. But I don't necessarily think that adopting ESG means that you're going to be starting out and you're going to be coming out of the gate scoring very high. And I don't think people are necessarily demanding that right now. But that's just my 2 cents, I guess. I don't see people coming out being perfect, but to have that data collected so that you can say, okay, last year we reduced CO2 emissions by this much, or last year our policy on marketing recyclable materials was X, and next year we want to improve that by 5%. And so to set those goals, I think that's a very important message, and it's the only way to set those goals is by having a data-driven, plan, sustainability plan like ESG. So I think there's a lot of room for folks to adopt that. And what, Ryan, if you're a new company and you're hearing about this, and the messaging could be coming from your employees, it could be coming from your board, it could be coming from investors that are asking these questions. What I know what the Fuels Institute plans on doing, and you and I have spoken about that, and we've convened a task force about this topic because we felt it was so important to get feedback from other folks that may have already adopted ESG or they're just starting to. And one of the things that the Fuels Institute would like to do is start convening some workshops on these, based upon industry. What do you think are the best initial steps here? If an organization wants to go down this path, and there's a couple of reasons why they might want to go down the path, right? It could be because they see that it's good for their bottom line, and it's good for their marketing, or maybe they see that, it could get codified into law. Right now it's voluntary, and the standards are kind of loosey-goosey. We're trying to figure out what those standards are and those best practices, what is material for each industry and all these things. So lots of moving parts. What do you think the next step for an industry that's new to ESG should be taking right now?
Well, I think you're right, Jeff. I mean, the first thing is, if you are a publicly traded company, investors are, we mentioned this at the beginning of the discussion, investors are kind of viewing this as table stakes. So, you're right. You're not necessarily going to come out of the gates on fire and performing really well. However, first of all, that's not the expectation. And so, I mean, we have to walk before we can run, and maybe crawl before we walk. But even beyond that, just signaling that you are taking some of these initial steps can be sufficient to say, look, we are doing these things. We're doing, some of the steps you might take are, we are establishing an ESG committee, or something along those lines. People have different names for it, but you're putting together a task force within your organization that recognizes this is something that's important to your shareholders and your stakeholders. But I think it's more and more it's looking like a fiat from institutional investors. And it's worth mentioning as well that it's not just publicly traded companies that are getting these requests or even demands from their boards and other kind of key stakeholders. A lot of privately held companies are getting these requests or, again, demands as well. So, I think it's worth establishing a committee. I think it's worth doing a peer evaluation. So, if you're in a particular, if you're in an industry, most likely in most companies that I've dealt with, they know exactly who their peer companies are. You'll have a discussion to say, hey, we do X, Y, Z. What does rival company number one do? The company that we kind of look up to, and maybe a company you kind of look down to. I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but I've seen that in a lot of places where you say, hey, if the company we look up to is doing it, we need to be able to tell our board that we are following similar steps. And God forbid the company you kind of look down at is ahead of you on this particular track. So do a peer evaluation, set up a committee, and start to really identify what the metrics are. Again, it's voluntary. Each organization gets to choose. And I think one way to look at it is to pick some metrics where you strongly suspect or that you're already doing very well. And that's a great place to start. and then maybe also find some metrics where you're not doing so well, but there are some kind of quick fixes that can be implemented to show improvement. So again, this can be characterized as kabuki for shareholders, but I would say, hey, you know what, at some level you may have to do that anyway, and some folks maybe already be ready for that type of performance and reporting. But honestly, I think it is an opportunity to create and capture value, to be a good steward for your organization, simply by tracking a few key metrics a little more closely and then ultimately reporting on them.
Yeah, and when we look at environmental, social, and governance, I think one of the things that the Fuels Institute would like to do is kind of bring to the table that environmental component, because there is a lot of data there. We know that, if you're on the fence thinking about this, I think everybody needs to understand that groups like Morningstar are merging with ESG rating groups like Sustainalytics already. And you can go out and you can find carbon scores. And so it's probably something that you should at least be aware of and educated on right now, and then make those decisions. Do we want to form a group within our organization to start studying this, because it's moving forward, and it's moving forward independently of regulation, of policy, which is kind of a big deal in my mind, to something that is climate change oriented, that is moving forward void of federal regulations and federal policies. To me, that message is really strong, and it does, unfortunately, it does bode well for policymakers in the future to glom onto that and possibly come up with policy and codify ESG practices. So it's, I think it's something where we really need to get our feet wet, get educated on, and have these discussions internally within the organizations. The feedback that we've gotten from the Fuels Institute board and board of advisors is that we need to focus on the driving factor right now on ESG, and that is climate change, however you feel about it. And the transportation industry is heavy on the CO2 emissions front. And we've been very involved in a number of different group discussions on this. And so understanding what goes into that model and collecting that data, it sure seems like something that we should be kind of kicking into high gear right now, even though it's voluntary. I can't stress that enough. Yeah, it's voluntary. We're looking at standards such as SASB and several others. We're starting to see a coming together of the groups that are creating standards, and they're starting to have a more unified voice. But when we look at the standards, and the Fuels Institute is got a very broad mix of industry, right? We've got fuel retailers, we've got OEMs. We're working with groups that are utility companies. I mean, it goes down the list. And so to look at that whole group of Fuels Institute, I think as early as this week, we're going to start establishing, some structure to each one of those groups to try to ferret out what is material, what goes into my ESG as a retailer, as a utility company. Now, of course, the utility companies have been doing this for a number of years. I think a number of them have moved into ESG already. But looking down the road, as far as CO2 emissions, I do not see the climate change discussion going away. It is here, and it's going to continue to be here. And as long as transportation fuels are the leading source of CO2 emissions, that bullseye is on industry. straight away. So I think it behooves us to respond accordingly. But so I think that's some of the, Ryan, I hope we get a chance to, we're going to stay in touch, and we're going to continue working on these types of workshops and pulling together industry here early, over the next couple of months, and start reaching out to some of the Fuels Institute members and participants, and bringing together, what does this plan look like? What data do we need to collect? What data is easy to collect? What data is hard to collect? And working with industry on trying to prepare for what, for all practical purposes, looks like it's coming at us. And how do we, how do you make lemonade out of lemons, right? This is a new requirement. We're all very busy. We all have lots of things going on to run our businesses. But how do we stand back and say, you know what, this is actually good for my bottom line. We need to invest some time, and we need to invest some money into this, because at the end of the day, it's going to really improve, as you said, our operational efficiencies. So this has been a great introduction. I really appreciate your time on this.
And Jeff, before we wrap, can I just
yeah.
highlight something you said? I think that the process that the Fuels Institute is undertaking right now to have a discussion about, what operational metrics are truly most impactful, and what metrics really tell the story of the industry, whether it's on the retail side or on the OEM side. I think that's extremely important. It's an extremely important proactive step, because in the event that something is codified quickly, or just the market pressures are overwhelming, I think Fuels Institute can play an important role in making sure that your members have a strong hypothesis, or even a counter argument, when it comes to someone trying to just kind of say by fiat, hey, here are the 5 things you need to care about. And maybe it comes from a state regulator or a federal regulator, or some other person with the power of government behind them. But nobody's going to know this industry as well as the members of the Fuels Institute. So, having kind of done your homework on this and preparing for it proactively, I think could pay a lot of dividends. Like you said, it improves your operational efficiencies and those key performance metrics, but also kind of allows you to weather potential regulatory storm, and have really good data and diligence behind it when you're talking about these issues with regulators, or whoever comes knocking on this issue.
Well, that's reassuring. It sounds like we're going down the right path, and we certainly have a fantastic industry representatives on our boards and participating in the Fuels Institute. So I'm really excited about those discussions and in those workshops to see what comes out of them. The Fuels Institute is policy agnostic, right? We do not take a position on any type of policy, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to assist industry in preparing for something that's coming at us, or prepare them for something that can create a monetary upside, and with those efficiencies. So I really appreciate those words. I think that's a sign that we're going down the right path, and hopefully we'll be having more of these discussions, and in trying to get this information out to industry on ways to improve. And I think the time is right, and I look forward to more discussions, Ryan. So again, I appreciate you taking the time today, and we'll follow up again very soon.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Jeff, for putting this together, and looking forward to chatting more about this topic.
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you. Take care.